Hi, this is Paul. One of you sent me this video of Bret and Heather and the Dark Horse podcast, and they were talking about the third man syndrome. Now, the name the third man syndrome might not be familiar to you, but stories of it you will find in television, you'll find it all over the place. And it's a great way to start this conversation about a lot of things. So let's have Bret and Heather introduce it, and then we'll get into some stories, and then we'll get into their analysis, and then we'll talk about a few more things. So let's start with this.
Hey, Zach, do you want to put up the tweet that I sent you large enough that I can stumble through reading it? Something caught my eye, and as is often the case, I'm going to need a little leash to explain where this all leads. For the moment, I'm just going to read the rather succinct rendering which I ran across that caused me to descend down this particular rabbit hole. The tweet, oh God, how do you pronounce this person's name? Brian Romanelli. I think it's Brian Romanelli.
Rommel or Romelli?
Romelli. Brian Romelli tweets, Third man syndrome. Third man syndrome is a particular psychological phenomenon in which, in the event of conditions of extreme resistance on the verge of death, the brain sends electrical signals called switches, such as to allude to the presence of an additional figure next to the exhausted person. Sir Ernest Shackleton, in his book South, described the phenomenon for the first time in 1919. He was convinced that a disembodied companion joined him and his men during the last leg of his 1914 to 1917 Antarctic expedition. The team was stuck in the pack ice for more than 2 years and endured immense hardships in the attempt to reach safety. Shackleton wrote, during that long and torturous march of 36 hours over the nameless mountains and glaciers of South Georgia, it often seemed to me that there were 4 of us, not 3. In recent years, well-known adventurers such as mountaineer Reinhold Messner and polar explorers Peter Hillary and Anne Bancroft have reported experiencing the phenomenon. Okay.
Okay. First thing to note that this is always framed. And the reason it's framed is we are grasping for a communal understanding, a way that all of us can sort of understand this together. Now, I'm going to argue that this is not completely disconnected necessarily from John Vervaeke's Hermes, okay? And when I say that, I know some of you are upset because you have jumped to the conclusion that John Vervaeke is talking to a demon. You don't know that. We really don't know what John Vervaeke is talking to. But the fact that he has gone public with this is significant because our communal, public, this common culture that we share is very much wrestling with, again, the end of modernity, which is deeply tied to the end of assumptions about public naturalism. I'll call it that way. Now, I'm going to talk about this book a bit today, and because I think this book and its presence in our world right now is incredibly important, that you have a very distinguished Yale scholar writing secular books about the impossible. And I'll just use Joseph of Cupertino and the stories around his levitation and all that those have, all that renders in the book. And levitation is an excellent example because, number one, there's no question that in a naturalistic frame, levitation is impossible. There's no question about that. Number two, levitation is fairly broadly known across different religious traditions. And so I know people are going to immediately jump, as has happened on this channel. Well, what about miracle claims of other religions? And my answer to that is, what about them? The assumption is that we have this public liturgy that we all must, as individuals, simply jump to and explain phenomena that are not explainable within our systems, Why must we do this? Why do we want to do this? Why is there so much pressure to do this? Those are really good questions. So it's very interesting that this particular tweet says, first described in 1914 and 1917, the Shackleton expedition. I would argue that, in fact, there's a very early story in which this is quite prominent. Now, one of the things to notice about the Shackleton account, which I have not looked it up, so I'm not aware, if all of them describe seeing this person, this fourth person, let's see, there were four of us, not three. If all of them describe seeing this fourth person, or only one of them describes seeing this fourth person, I wouldn't be at all surprised if all of them describe seeing this fourth person, because I haven't done extensive research into this, but I just going through the Rolodex of my memory, which is certainly fallible, this isn't just a psychological phenomena. Now, it's framed that way here. Why? Well, because we know that our minds are really complex, and I use that word intentionally because of where Bret and Heather eventually go with this conversation. I know our minds are complex, and so we experience a lot of phenomena that we cannot explain. Now, we can put Hermes in this category. We experience a lot of phenomena that we cannot explain. I regularly talk to people who hear voices. And I've been in a car with someone and they are asking me if I'm hearing the voices that they are, and I am saying, no, they're not. And when they're telling me what these voices are saying, I fairly quickly assume and use this as my working hypothesis that this person is having some sort of schizophrenic episode, and they are hearing voices, or schizoaffective, or they're under tremendous anxiety, etc., etc. That is not unfamiliar to that. Nor do I believe that there are angels in that case out there talking to this person, or that there are spirits talking to this person. The best explanation, because I know the person well, and I know their condition fairly well, and I've seen them, I've had experience with them in a whole variety of conditions, that they are in fact hearing other voices in their head. That is a psychological phenomena. I don't know that you can take all of these stories and put them into it. Now, it's that move, taking all of this data and shoehorning it into something, that is, in a sense, where we sort of have to pause and say, is that really fair? Or is that basically a way that we manage combinatorial explosiveness in a very large, very strange world? So I'm going to use Daniel 3 as an example of, let's say, third-person phenomena. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold 6 cubits high and 6 cubits wide and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. He then summoned the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, yada, 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 and everybody must worship them, and everybody's supposed to worship them. But of course, our three heroes, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they fail to worship them. Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king, and they're told to worship, and they don't, yada, yada, yada. The book's in public domain. You can find it quite easily. You don't have to buy it from our former president for $60. You can read it for free on the internet. So they throw them into the fiery furnace. Then Nebuchadnezzar was furious, and his attitude towards them changed. He ordered the furnace be heated 7 times hotter than usual, and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So these men, wearing their trousers, robes, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent and the furnace so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leapt to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, "Weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire?" They replied, "Certainly, your majesty." He said, "Look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods." All right, one of the delightful things about the book of Daniel is that there really is sort of a cultural meeting there, and it's an odd book, even if a lot of contemporary translations try to sort of try to sort of domesticate it into a sort of modernish frame for modernish Christians, but a son of the gods is in there. And of course, a good monotheist would say, well, I thought there weren't other gods. And you can read Michael Heiser and Jonathan Peugeot and ancient mythology and all of this kind of thing. But my point with this is, why the fourth person? The story would be fine without the fourth person. Suddenly there's a fourth person in there because clearly, naturally speaking, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, even within the confines of the story, whatever you believe about the story with respect to historicity or questions like that, the inclusion of a fourth person is a very interesting thing. Because, well, why would such a phenomena fit into this story? It's very interesting. So then, I see Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God. Now, of course, this is all set up in the book of Daniel, and the book of Daniel is setting up an entire conversation between, let's say, revolutionary monotheists like the captives of Israel with the polytheists of the great kingdom of Babylon. And the book itself is very interesting because, of course, the first chapters have all of these trials, all these ordeals, all these power struggles between the God of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and the God of Nebuchadnezzar and the Persians, etc., etc., etc. And then, of course, chapters 1 through 6, you have all of these confrontations where Daniel and his friends seemingly can never lose and never, and they can never be beaten. And then in chapter 7, you have this crisis of visions. And Daniel, who has been large and in charge during the first 6 chapters, in chapters 7 then is anxious and afraid. And then we have these visions of the nations, etc., etc. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire, but the fourth person did not come out of the fire. The satraps, prefects, governors, and royal advisors crowded around them. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair on their heads singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. Then, of course, obviously saying, praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angel, his messenger. That's basically what the word angel means. We tend to fill it with all kinds of other things, and that's part of where all this stuff goes. And rescued his servants. Okay, well, why would God have to send an angel to rescue his servants? Well, that's the way gods work. They send messengers to do this. Now, again, you have to begin to ask, well, why would even this ancient assumption about sending messengers? You have Jacob falling asleep at Bethel, and there's a great stairway, and angels are going back and forth up and down the stairway because they are doing God's bidding, and they are bringing down and enacting and doing all of this. And of course, someone can quite easily say, well, this would certainly be the worldview of these ancient people, that kings and that powerful people and emperors send emissaries and armies and commanders and people to do their bidding, etc., etc. So angels would be involved. Now, if you go to YouTube and you type in something, stories of angels, and then Among Us is like the first thing to come up. Reports, search, predictions. Oh, so this is what a lot of people search for. And you will find story after story after story after story after story. Now, if you're a thoroughgoing modernist, you would say, well, I don't believe any of these stories because there's no such thing as angels. Okay, well, fair enough. But the problem comes that these are, especially now in the day of YouTube, these are just out there. Now, it's not that these weren't out there before the internet. They were out there. And they might be published by a Christian press, or, again, back to this, they might be in a hagiography. One of the interesting points that Carlos, I don't know if his name should be Erie or Air, that Carlos Air makes is that there was an intensification of these stories in the 17th century, 16th or 17th and 18th century, as really the Enlightenment speeds up. And someone might say, well, that's of course a response to the fact that Protestants and others are dismissing these stories. You won't find that Protestant Catholic divide as salient well, it was salient historically, but you won't find it as salient today if you just look for angel stories. So let's not sort of prejudice the thing by calling them angels, and let's just have, let's say, normies out there, and we have this third man theory or this third man theory. Now suddenly we've sort of secularized it, but the stories remain. They're all out there. And so in this one video that took me all of 4 or 5 seconds to find, this person just dumped a whole bunch of them from TikTok into it, and well, here they are. They're very interesting stories.
Weeks before my 23rd birthday, I was attacked by my dog, and he literally took a chunk out of my arm, including my arteries, my bone. It's all gone. Well, at the time, we somehow got him off of me, and we were just screaming. It was like 2 a.m. for help, screaming for help. I was army crawling through my blood. I get inside. I'm literally starting to black out, and then appears this man.
Now, we're going to talk about this word literally, because my friend Michael Satori did a response video that I'm all wet with respect to this word. You will find this word regularly in these videos. Why is that? I would argue that literally, really, actually, all come under the use of an emphasis. They are emphatic about what they are saying. Because if you back it up a little bit,
inside, I'm literally starting to black out.
She's literally starting to black out. Literally. And of course, there's the Mad TV joke about that. That has become into our language. Now, what does she mean by that? She doesn't need that word literally in there. Or, I am starting to black out. The sentence says exactly what it does before without that word. So we're going to have to talk about that word. I don't know if we'll probably do it in this video, but it deserves its own video. My point is, this word is used as an emphasis and a tell of someone's worldview. Okay, on with the story.
And then for help, I was army crawling through my blood. I get inside. I'm literally starting to black out. And then appears this man. I vividly remember him in a hood. And I know I was dying. My dog's eating, sorry. Because I remember the back of his head. And apparently he had a dog with him. He tied his dog up and he came and tourniqueted me. So essentially he's the person who stopped me from dying. And he sat with me while we waited for the ambulance. I got in the ambulance and went to the hospital, and I still to this day have no clue who that person is. He literally disappeared. So
he literally disappeared. She used that word again. Why? It's a word that describes emphasis. And again, she could say, well, go back over the details of her story. It's interesting.
I'm literally starting to black out, and then appears this man. I vividly remember him in a hood, and I know I was dying. My dog's eating, sorry, because I remember the back of his head. And apparently he had a dog with him. He tied his dog up, and he came and tourniqueted me.
Okay, so this man physically ties a tourniquet onto this woman. Was this man physical, or was this man a psychological thing? Well, psychological dynamics generally don't apply tourniquets. Now you might say, well, maybe she applied a tourniquet to herself. Could be. I mean, there are whole ranges of what, let's say, and this is what's going to get complex. Let's say what a video camera would record. We'll say it that way. Hard to know. No way to know. There'll probably never be a way for history to know. Could it have been just a passerby who had been walking their dog and it helped? Could be that. Could be a whole range of things, but there'll be no explanation for it, or perhaps not an explanation that satisfies some people. What she knows is her description.
So essentially, he's the person who stopped me from dying, and he sat with me while we waited for the ambulance. I got in the ambulance and went to the hospital, and I still to this day have no clue who that person is. He literally disappeared, so...
He literally disappeared. Well, what does that mean? Well, again, it's a use of emphasis. Maybe he physically disappeared. Maybe he visually disappeared. And again, my admonition is when you're tempted to use that word literally, just pause and think a little bit more carefully about exactly what you mean. Because we can literally see the handwriting on the wall. Well, what exactly do you mean by that? Do you mean that there is handwriting on the wall? No, I mean that we can see what's coming next. Oh, okay. Then why did you say you can literally see the handwriting on the wall? Because you're using that for emphasis. Or maybe you actually read letters that were on a wall. Well, maybe you should say visually. Or maybe you should say, I physically saw. Well, do we physically see? I mean, again, just when you're going to use that word, just pause and ask yourself, what do now I'm going to use a different word, really. It works the same way. What do I want to say? Because really, literally, actually is much more sort of a phenomenological word. There's no good substitute for the way we use this word. There are other words that can be used, and so my admonition is think carefully and think about a better word than literally, because it's really not a good word. Anyway, great story. This video has more stories. Well, just a little bit of analysis of the story.
I noticed while researching this video that whatever this may be, consciousness, ghost, angel, it seems to appear to people in their most comforting form.
Okay, now, the fact that the agent or non-agent or phenomena or whatever word you want, you notice how language escapes us. It's pretty dependent on worldview. So a materialist will tend to say, well, it's sort of a hallucination. Oh, okay, but hallucinations don't tie tourniquets. Well, maybe she tied the tourniquet herself. Well, maybe. What was used to tie the tourniquet with? That could be a good question to ask. Because if it's her own belt or something, there's usually not, let's say, a piece of, maybe it was the dog leash. I don't know. Again, if you had a relationship with this person, you could go into it, but chances are good that even with not a whole lot of time, there are a whole bunch of questions you might have that can likely never be answered. But the fact that there's a degree of comfort involved in this. And so, okay, lots of angel stories about this, accompanying stories about this. And again, it's not the case that there's just one answer to many of these questions. We have sort of taken all of these stories, lumped them into one thing, and already we've sort of prejudiced ourselves to imagine that there's one answer to all of these stories, where in fact there may be multiple answers to any given story, or there may be multiple kinds of answers that could apply to different stories along the way. Here's another fun one that's in here.
Man syndrome. So I have to preface this by saying I think it's just a life and death situation, a survival situation. I don't think you necessarily have to be in a car accident for this to happen to you, because...
Okay, but now notice, and here's another issue, where most tellers are not naive about the filters through which they will be heard. And this is one thing that strikes me about the John Vervaeke situation with Hermes right now, in that John's an interesting case in that on one hand, he's, by his own admission, he's got a fair amount of, he has better words for this. Unlike me, who feels very comfortable in front of an audience and in front of a camera, generally speaking, John is fairly reticent. Now, many people in my experience have experiences like this. Few of those people are willing to share their accounts publicly. Now, that has both to deal with the person, their temperament, who they are, and it also has to do with their read of the cultural surround. And a lot of this has to do will I gain status or lose status among the people that I care about? And so people will tell or won't tell these stories, and you've got things on both sides of the teller and the imagined audience that are depending on, well, I'll get a lot of attention. I like attention, so I'm going to tell this story. Maybe I'm going to embellish it, or maybe I'm super reticent to tell this story, but I'm worried about my own sanity because the world has this sort of communal, materialist, public knowledge filter that we have, and I'll lose status, so I'll just tell my pastor because I trust my pastor, and he can't tell anybody else.
I was in the ocean and I broke my neck and I nearly drowned. And then when I was pulled out onto the sand, I realized that I was paralyzed, that I couldn't move my body, and I was really freaking out. It was chaotic. A crowd formed around me, and I was obviously freaking out because I can't feel my body. I can't move, and yeah, I remember looking over to my left and there's this beautiful girl. She could have been anywhere between 18 and 50, but she was wearing a black bikini, and she held my hand. And
I have to admit that if this showed up on one of those 1980s or 90s Touched by an Angel television show accounts that sort of gets mythologized and wrapped up in a worldview, an angel in a bikini is just something that kind of makes me giggle, but we'll go on.
and I remember looking over to her, and she was holding my hand, and she was exuding just peace and calmness, and I calmed down. I stopped freaking out, and it was very reassuring and comforting, and I was able to just like stabilize my emotions. But the thing is, nobody that I was with that day really remembers her. And I don't even remember at what point like she left. Like she was holding my hand, and then I calmed down, and then it was like she was gone, but I didn't even really remember her leaving, or her being around. She was just like there in that moment that I needed to be brought down to earth and calm down and I needed the reassurance. That's when she was there, and then she was gone. And I don't talk about this part of my accident very often because it's a little out there, and people will just, I don't know. I don't know what people think, but she was very.
See, right there's the reticence. But again, also the internet has this weird effect on people that if they're sitting in a room talking to screens, it's like, I'll say things into a screen maybe I wouldn't say to another person that was physically in my presence. So, interesting dynamic.
Very real to me. She was very real to me, and nobody remembers her, the girl in the black bikini.
Oh, this actually happened to me when
So, here's another one.
I was 16. I was in a really bad car accident 2 weeks into getting my license. It was just me in the car. And I was making a left turn, and then someone hit me right on the side of my car. My car ended up on another side of the street. The wheel popped off. I ended up sideways. The other car, they had to get emergency surgery, all that jazz. But when I got hit, my car started spinning, and I remember screaming. And the second my car stopped at a halt, a man knocked on my driver's window. And I think I got out. I really don't remember if I got out or if I tried to roll the window down. But I remember I think I got out. So let's say I did get out. And he was like, "Hey, are you okay?" And I was like, "Yeah, I'm fine." I don't really remember exactly what our conversation was. And then I remember we had that super brief conversation. I turn around to look to see like where the other car was, and I look back, and where he was standing, he was gone. So I looked around, he was nowhere to be found. And then after all that happened, I thought, when my car stopped, immediately when my car stopped is when that man was at my window. So there was no way that he walked into the middle of the street as my car was literally spinning in the middle of the street. Right after I got hit. So it was just a really weird situation. And I've like told people about it, and they're like, "What?" But I didn't know third man syndrome was a thing. Or the third man phenomena. So that makes me feel a little less crazy and a little more comforted.
So what is
Okay, so there it is again. Third, now other people are talking about this. We have a name for this, so now I'll tell the story. And again, you visit people in the hospital and they just had surgery and they're on drugs and they're very hazy and they see things, and that's very common. So could just be a hallucination, could be a psychological phenomenon. And you can't just say third man syndrome is this, because there could be a whole realm of things that have happened, and third man syndrome just sort of is a name. This is where we get into sort of Peugeotian naming, is a name that kind of includes a whole bunch of things that are out there, and it's just sort of a useful thing among us. So now let's get into Bret and Heather, and they're working on it.
Let's just take that at face value. I've done a little looking both into Shackleton's expedition and the report that this is a actually fairly widespread phenomenon that psychology has taken seriously. But I wanted to use it for really two purposes. This is not a hypothesis that I thought to advance, but it's very much in keeping with some things that I have done some work on. So here we have the hypothesis that there might be something, from my perspective, it would be an evolutionary something that has endowed human beings with...
Okay, now again, we get a sense of what a worldview does with us. A worldview sort of reaches out into the world to appropriate stories and make sense of them so we can bring them in. I've told the story before of, this was early on in the Jordan Peterson days. Jordan Peterson goes on a podcast. I don't remember which one. I could dig it up in my archives, I'm sure. And he tells a ghost story. And he and one of his grad students, who I'm not going to name, but fairly well known, he and a grad student of his, they go to a conference or something, and they stay in a hotel room together. And I don't remember the details of it. Again, all these things, you can look it up. I'm not being unfaithful to the story. They have to stay in this hotel room, and the hotel room is known to be haunted. What do we mean by haunted? See, even the word that you use prejudices the entire story, because you need a name for what happens. And in this hotel room, like, drawers get opened mysteriously and weird things happen. If you want to have a little bit of fun with this, check out the Del Coronado in San Diego. This is a favorite place my wife and I often like to stay. And there are certain rooms that are famously haunted in the Del Coronado. And even just mentioning hauntings, Christians will go all different directions with respect to hauntings and ghosts, etc., etc. So Jordan and this other guy were going to stay in this hotel room. And I verified this. I talked to the other guy. And because we were talking about, this was early on in the Jordan Peterson thing, and I was making videos, and my videos caught his attention. And so he reached out to me and wanted to talk to me about Jordan and just share a few things about Jordan, which was fine. But then because I had heard this story, I wanted to verify with the other guy what had happened. And basically the other guy verified and this is where I often say, think about one option to substitute for the word literally, physically. When they returned back to the hotel room, all of the drawers were out in the hotel room. And that none of the staff had gone into that hotel room and pulled the drawers out. I mean, it's just a dumb, silly little thing that sort of rattles you because, well, why does it rattle you? Well, because you wonder, well, was someone else in my room? Well, what if someone else was in your room? Well, if someone else was in your room, it was housekeeping. They're authorized. I mean, see, here's the combinatorial explosiveness of it. There's an entire world that is within this little story that we sort of have all compressed and built into certain liturgies and work with different things. And, well, no hotel staff had been in that room. That room was known by the hotel staff to be haunted. The ghost in that hotel room was just particularly playful in terms of doing things. And so then this was told by Jordan on a podcast that I saw on the internet. And I verified it from the other individual that, yeah, that's just like Jordan had said. But I knew the other individual was skeptical about some of this wooey stuff. And so I asked him. I said, well, what do you think about this? And he says, strange things happen. And I have found this regularly. And it's not a bad thing, because everyone does it with respect to their religion or their worldview. Because a lot of honest people recognize that their religion or their worldview only accounts for so much. And then there are these other sort of remainders out there. And then they have a saying for the remainder. And the saying for the remainder is, weird things happen. My interest, of course, is in this entire dynamic of us trying to account for the world, because that's really what religion does, engage productively with the world, and have, and again, because I'm a pastor, this isn't just interesting for me. I'm just not interested in my own little religion that I keep in my heart and practice myself. I'm interested in having a community that actually works on this and shares it together. And once you get into a community working on this and sharing it together, what you realize is, well, Ryan Burge just had a little piece on Substack. How many Catholics agree with the church's position on hot topics? And he basically goes through and makes a point that almost anybody who pays any attention to religious communities know. People who actually, let's say, participate within, let's say, a group of religious services, or identify under a broad religious heading like Catholics or Protestants, they seldom mirror all the official positions of that institution. And so here they found capital punishment, abortion, all sorts of issues that Catholics don't necessarily mirror the position of their church. And he goes on to say, hey, not just Catholics, Protestants too. Ligonier, that's a conservative Calvinist group, has been conducting annual polls that ask very specific doctrinal questions. Among evangelicals, Barna used to do these kind of polls all the time. Among evangelicals who took part in this questionnaire, there are a bunch of notable findings. And again, now these are people who would say identify as evangelical, but in the United States, because of, let's say, the force of mass media, evangelical just might mean Republican conservative in many places. They might not go to church, they might not participate. And so you actually have to take a great deal of care. But even a pastor of a very small church like mine, if I actually sit down and talk to people about what they think, you find a huge range of beliefs. And if you give people a little bit more license to, let's say, explain a sermon or retell a sermon, it's really amazing what you hear come back at you. And so that's part of the reason I enjoy doing it. Tell me what you heard in this sermon. Because it's always some of them and a little bit of how their worldview sort of reached out and appropriated it. And so, of course, this is what Bret is going to do with this story. From his worldview, all of this work that he's always doing on evolutionary biology, he's going to reach out and try to appropriate this third man syndrome and make sense of it within an evolutionary lens. This is, in a way, the way he appropriates it and brings it into his worldview.
Some sort of programming that causes the...
Now, I know some of you are annoyed because I've interrupted him already. The video where he's uninterrupted is available on the internet. In fact, the link is below. And if you would prefer to hear my commentary without, hear me comment after you've heard the whole thing, by all means, pause the video, hit the link below, watch the video, and you can come back to this. Odds are this is a really bad YouTube strategy, because chances are you will watch some of it, get distracted, and click another little video on the side, and off we go into this endless thing of one video after another. But I am going to interrupt him. And I've even just interrupted myself interrupting him. Because notice what he's doing. He's trying to fit this into his worldview.
Some sort of programming that...
Programming. Language is important. Programming. Now, this is key in terms of understanding how the imaginary that Bret uses to try to understand and appropriate these dynamics. And I've listened to enough Michael Levin now that as I listen to Bret talk about genetics, I think, genetics feels so 2000 genetics feels so 2010-ish. Now the electroceuticals and the flatworms and the fact that there seems to be this other layer of sort of computational electroceutical programming that goes on and turns and off cells. And of course, you've got epigenetics and all of this stuff. But Bret's got to use his worldview, just like I use the Bible and Christianity and theology. I got to use my worldview. All of our worldviews are limited because, a little bit later, he's going to talk about synthesis. Actually, many of the issues that he talks about as this video goes on are super important and super relevant to this whole thing. And I'm not going to have a chance to actually cover the whole thing.
Causes the sensation, the experience of being accompanied by someone in the midst of a life-threatening emergency. Mm-hmm. Now, it should be, I think, clear to anybody who pays attention to Dark Horse and our way of thinking that the adaptive value of this is almost self-evident. If you are faced with such a situation, then your evolutionary well-being may hinge on whether or not you can keep going in the face of such a thing.
Now, your evolutionary well-being, I would assume, would be thinking about your capacity to reproduce after. And as you've seen, at least the people that were indicated in the little TikTok, sample bias by those who use TikTok, obviously, would survive this extreme situation and go on to be able to reproduce. And so Bret sort of assumes that this somehow is carried on in the code of the genes. Now, I would argue that probably it's the mimetic level that is carrying this over, but Bret will get into that as well when he talks about the fact that he sees religion as having an adaptive advantage.
If you try and fail, you've lost nothing. And if you succeed because you feel that you are not alone, that something is watching out for you, that could be highly beneficial. So at the very least, we can say that there is an adaptive explanation for why you might experience this that does not require there to be any...
And we can cut to the chase with this. Let's say it is a psychological phenomena, and people who, whether it's passed on genetically or mimetically, people who have this capacity to, and I would argue, well, again, don't sleep, they're snakes. I've made that point in a variety of videos. Maybe I should just clip my telling of that story out of it. Basically, you have a first world missionary who wants to create a Bible translation for a tribe who has very little contact with the world network. And he is living with them, and he's learning their language, and he's moved in there with his family. And one day, there's a whole ruckus in the village because a god has appeared on the far shore of the river, and the whole village is out there looking at the god, and the missionary and the daughter get up and look across the river, and they say nothing. And the whole village is like, look, it's the god. And they're like, I don't see anything. Now, to me, this leads me to assume that the naturalist way of accounting for our experience in the world is tremendously limited. Because a naturalist way of accounting might say, you either see or you don't see, depending on what's physically out there. Whereas, we've touched on this channel many times before, that seeing, of course, is not as straightforward a thing as we used to think back when we thought, well, you can put a camera on a computer and it will see. Oh, no, we have now discovered that you have combinatorial explosiveness in terms of what is appearing before you. And this experience of sight that we have is actually after a whole bunch of processing to determine what we see and don't see. And, we can make that. You can go back to that dude in a gorilla suit counting the number of basketball bounces to see whether or not you saw the gorilla, and simply a little frame change in terms of what to look for. Suddenly you see the person in the monkey suit, whereas before the same video was in front of you and you never even saw the gorilla. So right away, this seeing and not seeing, this physical representation, and a physical representation that can be captured by the technology that creates electronic images like this camera is presenting to you. This is not the whole bit of the story, but let us continue.
External force in the universe that selection could have endowed
Okay, now I should back that up and get a little bit more context.
us with this. There is an adaptive explanation for why you might experience this that does not require there to be any external force in the universe.
Now notice how he has to pause, and because what's happening in our culture, it's getting harder and harder to try to figure out how to language the other. I would say it's getting harder and harder to figure out how to continue to exclude languaging the other, because the more we discover about the complexity of experience, human experience in this world, it's hard to know where us ends and other begins. It is getting that complex. And we have this in many different fronts right now in terms of extraterrestrials or angels or spirit or phenomena. And this is the way in which modernity is receding, and it's becoming harder and harder to simply deny a bunch of this. Now, my friend Cal Zeldin on Twitter the other day, I really leaned on him to read. Let's get rid of the... I really leaned on him hard to start reading They Flew. And I've gotten through about half of the book, and he said, you got to really read the epilogue. I'm right now in biolocation, which is a fascinating phenomena. But we can just keep it to Joseph of Cupertino, because what I love about the Joseph of Cupertino stories is it was clear that not only are there just way too many witnesses to just discount this as there being nothing there, but it's also the case that even those who are sort of in charge of it did not know how to handle this. In fact, Sunday, we were worshiping and we were singing, and I was singing and I was enjoying the singing and all of the feels that you get from that and Christian worship. And then I thought of Joseph of Cupertino and his raptures. And the funny thing about Joseph of Cupertino is that, and others, that these raptures were quite involuntary. In fact, they were the raptures they loved, but the physical manifestations of it they found extremely troublesome, because, in fact, a great Joseph of Cupertino in his life had a great deal of trouble because of these physical manifestations, because how these physical manifestations would just permeate out into the community around them. And it was not, to me, it wasn't disconnected from what you see in, let's say, the Gospel of Mark, where Jesus keeps telling people, hey, I'm going to heal you, but don't tell anybody about this. Because there's something about when word gets out of something, I don't want to use the word supernatural because I don't like that framing. When a manifestation, that's what the Dominicans would call it in the manifestación, a manifestation. When a manifestation would happen, well, things would just get weird. And so, they'd take Joseph of Cupertino, and they kept trying to hide him in places because the poor dude couldn't say a mass without flying up, and then everybody would gawk. And then if they wanted to sort of impress somebody who was a Lutheran at that point, they thought, we got to de-Lutheran this guy. So let's have Joseph of Cupertino fly in front of him, and he'll become a Catholic. And in one case, he did. He said, well, okay, now I know that the Catholic faith is the true faith, and on and on. Others were just sort of wanting to see it. And then with some of these stories of levitation, apparently these were involuntary. The people would sort of be frozen. They'd sort of be caught up in their rapture, and they would float, and and then people would sort of play with them. They'd sort of poke at them, or they'd put fire on them to see if they'd be burning or feel. And so even Carlos Eyre and other commentators have to try to figure out how to fit them into their system, a theological system, a worldview system. But they're just these accounts that they just don't fit in. And as Cal Zeldin was saying, well, what a lot of modernity seems to be is just sort of this filter. So Rick, when he runs the streaming for the service, we don't have particularly good sound equipment to capture the sound. And so sometimes, a motorcycle will go by or somebody with a really large stereo and so what Rick will do is try to sort of gate the sound and say anything above this frequency, we're just going to get rid of. Anything below this frequency, we're just going to get rid of. And modernity sort of does that. It sort of gates our believability. And so like Jordan Peterson's colleague, well, how do you account for all those drawers being different when you came back to your hotel room? Strange things happen. So we just have that outside the gate. And you do that to maintain your worldview. And there's no moral problem with trying to maintain your worldview. You have to maintain a worldview. And so you will sort of clip out other things. And so when Brendan Dempsey says, well, what do you do with Islamic miracle stories? I shrug. I just sort of clip them out of my worldview. Now, I'm not saying they did happen or didn't happen. I'm skeptical about them. And I'm more believable about things that are sort of within me. And it's sort of like how I am with respect to fantastic stories that people tell me in real person. Because I know the person. And sometimes certain people tell me a fantastic story, and I think they've always got a fantastic story. This is sort of C.S. Lewis's Lucy test. They've always got some strange story. That's just and sometimes because it's something that I was with them and I saw the same things and I look at it and say, that didn't happen. But I know the person. And I don't think any less of them. It's just how they tell stories. Sometimes there are other people that they're very, they might be an ardent materialist, but when they come and say it happened, like Jordan Peterson's colleague, well, I believe them. Why? Because it doesn't fit into their worldview. It's the point that C.S. Lewis makes at the beginning of his excellent book, Miracles. The only person that I know, C.S. Lewis meaning I personally know, who has claimed to have seen a ghost doesn't believe in ghosts. And that's why her claim about the ghost is most credible, because it doesn't fit into her worldview. And again, we commonly use this kind of thing, that sort of contra-narrative events told by a person. We tend to give them better status because it's not in their interest to share this. Just like for many people, it's not in their interest to share a fantastical story. But all of these things sort of have to fit into a worldview. And someone recently was talking about bounded set versus centered set. And I told them that bounded set and centered set actually work together. And you need those boundaries. And in fact, you account for things outside the boundaries too. They're just beyond the pale. And you might say, well, strange things happen. I can't explain it with my worldview. That's fine. But my worldview, I hold to and I keep holding to, because this actually has been working very well for me to make sense of my world and help me profitably go through my life. And I think it's true. Well, you kind of have to say you think it's true because you need an operating system that works. And if you didn't think it was true, you would adopt a new worldview or you would adjust your worldview. This is simply how we use worldviews in order to march through the world.
Universe, that selection could have endowed us with this very circuit for adaptive reasons. And if so, that tells us one thing is very...
Now let's take a look at, because he's going to get into metaphorical truth and all of that. When he says circuit, what does he mean? Because what is a circuit? Well, it's literally a circuit. See, bad use of the word. Well, what do you mean? It's chemically a circuit in terms of brain chemistry. It's physically a circuit in terms of a little gate that opens and closes. That's why when you hear that word literally, or especially when it's about to come out of your lips, pause and ask yourself, is there a better word I could use for that? Or am I just saying, if I could say actually or really, you're just adding emphasis. Just think about what dimension are you actually trying to highlight?
Very interesting. It tells us something about the power of this Darwinian evolutionary force to shape things like psychology, that enough people...
Okay, so basically he's making up a story here that says, well, there's a powerful force evolutionarily that gives people the capacity to be visited, some people the capacity to be visited by a third-party stranger who is also comforter, who can go all the way to possibly include applying a tourniquet. Can you show us that physically? No. Can you show us that psychologically? Well, what do you mean by show? Basically, what we do is that we have all of these accounts of it, and we have a worldview that says, well, we have to somehow account for all of these things in the way that my worldview affords. Therefore, and it seems to be a positive thing, allowing such and such a people to survive an extraordinarily ordeal. Therefore, that's part of the package of what we are endowed with. And it's like, well, it's convenient. Is it true? Is it testable? No. And, in all fairness, as they go through this, they understand. And what's interesting about this video is you can just sort of see the physicalism, the naturalism, the materialism continue to break down. And that's why people change worldviews. And that's why communally, collectively, worldviews and their popularities continue to recede and other worldviews arise because, well, we could say probably over the most part, in a very dead reckoning sort of way, they actually seem to do better.
People would have survived a near-death experience by virtue of the presence of such a thing, to have reinforced it so that the mechanism is something like general. And that is, I would say, I won't speak for you, but I'm sure you agree, that is the Darwinism that I believe in. A very powerful shaping.
Okay. See, part of what's going on behind this video is that they are responding to the fact that, well, surveys say more and more people are getting skeptical with respect to Darwinism. Now, these class of isms are pretty problematic right now in our little corner, thanks to Mark Parker and Jacob Federecci. We might have a debate on Calvinism, and every time I hear that, I sort of chuckle because I think, well, first you're going to have to tell me exactly what you're debating. How do you define Calvinism? And generally speaking, a lot of people out there sort of reduce Calvinism to double predestination, and then you can set up a little meme like this. Conversations with Calvinist Jesus. Master, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Nothing. I've assigned you to hell. So you sort of have this little reduction of Calvinism down to a certain imagination of double predestination. And whereas I was hoping that my Twitter feed today would be engaged with insightful conversation with respect to Bret Weinstein's video, instead Jacob and others have colonized my Twitter stream to argue about reductive Calvinism. But a big part of what's going on in this video is, in fact, that they are continuing to adjust. Well, what on earth do you mean by Darwinism? And then in the comment section, you'll have some of the debate about, well, we could see how this adaptation within species can go, but can you really use this as an account to basically give a plausible account for the entire stack?
Force, a sculpting force that is capable of doing mind-blowing things like that. Now, I did want to say, although I didn't think to hypothesize this, I have hypothesized something next door. What I've hypothesized is that the hallucinations that dying people sometimes have, hallucinations that often amount to references to people who have died before them, family members, to journeys, boarding a train, a boat, going somewhere, that those things are, according to the hypothesis, adaptive, and that their purpose seems mysterious. What does it matter what a dying person sees, right? To their fitness, that is. But it could matter very much if this person transitioning from life to death gives evidence of an afterlife. That might have a profound influence on the living. And that fits perfectly with the literally false, metaphorically true model of religion that is...
Now, I still think that his languaging for this is really bad. Literally false. First of all, You mean physically false? Again, the gun in the chamber. There's a bullet in the chamber. You don't need to add another word. There's literally a bullet in the chamber. That literally word is just emphasis. There's physically a bullet in the chamber. Oh, okay. Well, that actually adds a little bit to the sentence. There's really a bullet in the chamber. No, it depends what your realism is, because that's in fact what we're talking about. So this, and it also sort of gets betrayed by the fact that there's, in a deep sense, all language is metaphorical. So even the framing of it
is in our book, and that we have talked about extensively here.
So just to add a little detail there, the fitness value that you're proposing for end-of-life visions is to family members, presumably, that are in attendance. It's an inclusive fitness. It's so-called inclusive fitness value, which is to say that the benefit accrues to those who share copies of the writing of your DNA by common descent, as opposed to just members of your species or members of related species. But
right.
Which is a pretty amazing thing to say when it seems that just about everybody in the world genetically has the capacity to believe these stories, because up until a fairly short amount of time ago, we sort of assumed that just about everybody in the world believed these sort of stories. So I don't know if that was sort of inside or if it was just simply absolutely common to sort of the package. And again, it's sort of, I struggle to imagine that this is really riding on the genetic train as opposed to the mimetic train.
It's an inclusive fitness value.
It's an inclusive fitness. That's very well said. Now, this, of course, puts us in a predicament. That is a decidedly materialist view of a measurable phenomenon. And the reaction to such arguments is predictable. People of faith typically do not like such materialist arguments, and they are not wrong. Let me just point out that, let's take the third man phenomenon. For the third man phenomenon to work, one must not discount the experience of being accompanied as simple programming.
Now, it's the discounting of experience as such where a lot of this real work happens. Because, and it isn't to say that everything must be accepted. As I said, if I'm riding in a car with somebody that I know regularly hears voices, and they will start to tell me about what these voices say, and then I'll ask them, and are the voices talking now? Yeah. And I'll say something like, we're in traffic. And if you look, are they in the back seat? No, they're not in the back seat. Are in the trunk of the car? No, they're not in the trunk of the car. And, if someone was standing outside this door, and, we're 2 blocks away by now, you're not going to hear them anyway. Of course, one of the things that you realize is that this sort of logic doesn't actually get you very far. It seems obvious to me who's not hearing the voices, but for the person hearing the voices. Now, again, in a case like that, I don't understand the psychological dynamics or the psychiatric dynamics of this voice hearing, but it's not that uncommon, and I'm fairly used to it with a bunch of my friends, so fine. And so we'll talk about what the voices say, and then I'll usually engage in a little bit of conversation with respect to what the voices are saying, and then sort of take it from there. But again, we all sort of have this worldview, and there's these phenomena that are sort of around the boundaries, and we have to figure out what to do with this phenomena. And most of what we do is just sort of block it out. Sometimes we stigmatize it. And again, I'm not saying stigmatizing it is always bad. We could say that stigmatizing is an adaptive sociological reality in human communities in order to maintain centers and fringes.
To the extent that one views it as a distortion of reality, its effect is liable to be reduced or eliminated. So,
Well, what you haven't said is that the third man phenomenon, if it is an adaptive phenomenon, as you were alluding to, works only if you believe that it is real.
Yes.
That is what you are proposing.
That is what I'm suggesting. Now, I don't exactly believe that. My guess is...
As well, you shouldn't, because I'm sure you regularly find people who have a worldview, and then they have an experience outside their worldview, and what that provokes in them is a change of their worldview. You find that, in fact, it's all the time. Talk to someone who is an alcoholic, and on one hand, they might say, I can quit drinking anytime. Oh, really? Maybe you should start now, buddy, because look at what it's done to your life. And then, of course, they have a series of transformations. Maybe they get jailed. Maybe there's a confrontation. Maybe their health collapse, something like this. And then they have a transformation and they see the world in a whole different way. This happens all the time with human beings. It's one of our most astounding capacities to, in fact, manage worldviews by which we can see the world from different positions and, in fact, maintain whole different matrices of worldviews through which we can engage a physical world in a whole variety of different ways.
It is useful even if you know that you are hallucinating. But it is surely more useful if you think the universe has noticed your peril and cares about it and has delivered you a shepherd, right? So what I'm trying to do here is to point out two things. This is not a minor fact in the argument between those who would say that religion is a mind virus, it is a distortion, it is parasitizing people by traveling along in our cognitive architecture. That portrayal is wrong. It must be wrong because it does not make sense for us.
New atheism is dead. It's dead. And to that degree, those of you out there, won't mention anybody, know a whole bunch of you have someone coming to mind right now who's particularly active in the comment section, is in that way sort of a dinosaur. Your day has gone by. Your gurus are passing quickly, and, you know, the most visible, youngest, active one you have left is... well, the two you have left, one is now identifying as a cultural Christian, and the other one is selling basically religious wares under a guise of made safe for atheists.
To allow ourselves to be infected with a mind virus of such great expense as ancient religious doctrines. So, the idea that religious belief is literally false but metaphorically true has an important impact. It's not subtle. And in this case, the reason that I focused on this presentation of the third man phenomenon is that it makes a life and death argument about the value of belief in something that isn't literally present. But
okay, please stop using that word. That isn't physically present. That's a perfectly good word. There might be another word that's better to use. You won't find a word that can simply be substituted for literally in every occasion. Again, literally is in many ways, I believe, a vestige of the Renaissance period where you have this turn to the text. And that held sway up until in the post-Reformation period. The Bible and reason didn't prove to be the answer that Luther had hoped it would resolve. And therefore we turn to reason and empiricism to try to establish, well, here is a communal basis upon which we can all agree in terms of physicalism. And now we are at the point where we're realizing that physicalism is not necessarily itself a sufficient platform by which we can all agree. We've derived many benefits from physicalism. And this technology that we all share and enjoy has given us many things that we like, but we are reaching the end of that period.
Hearing that it is not literally present will grate on those who have faith, But I want you to hear the second part. Metaphorically true is not simply saying this is a metaphor, right? By saying metaphorically true, the point is there is an actual reality there. It is not a literal description of somebody traveling with you, presumably. It is an illusion that has the capacity to deliver life from the jaws of death. And that is not false, right?
And again, and he's going to talk about this in a minute, but language is really hard. And part of the reason that these transformations in our public imaginary are often are negotiated with careful changes of words are because the words get threadbare and no longer do what they used to do. They lose their magic, if it were. And in fact, both sides of his literally true metaphor, literally false, metaphorically true, both sides of that coupling need to be refreshed, because neither is actually able to deliver the payload. Neither is illusion, because again, as he just said before, illusion's a really bad word. It's a really bad word. And well, let's look for an example. According to one Roman tradition, the Temple of Jupiter, where Cicero harangued Catiline on 8 November 63 BCE, has been established 7 centuries earlier by Romulus, Rome's founding father. Romulus and the new citizens of his tiny community were fighting their neighbors, a people known as the Sabines. On the site that later became the Forum, the political center of Cicero's Rome, things were going badly for the Romans, and they had been driven to retreat. At a last attempt to snatch victory, Romulus prayed to the god of Jupiter, not just Jupiter, but in fact Jupiter Stator. Now it's really interesting because Marian visions, Maria de Guadalupe, Maria de Altagracia, Maria de a little place in Wisconsin. It's interesting the way this dynamic works. And, well, it's not just sort of Jupiter per se. It's Jupiter here and now. Not, in fact, Jupiter, but, in fact, to Jupiter Stator, Jupiter who holds men firm. He would build a temple in thanks, Romulus promised the gods, if only Romans would resist the temptation to run for it and stand their ground against the enemy. They did. And the temple of Jupiter Stator was erected on that very spot, the first in a long series of shrines and temples in the city built to commemorate divine help in securing military victory for Rome. Now, I think this is a great illustration of what Bret is looking to talk about, that, well, illusion isn't the right word. A spirit, a collective spirit, a communal spirit. Some might even say that you can go and find these. Now, here's another great example. This is a book I read a number of years ago, The Great and Holy War, How World War I Became a Religious Crusade. What's interesting in Philip Jenkins' account of the First World War is not so much the fact that these nations were deeply religious who fought it, and there were all sorts of very interesting religious stories and tales that would come back out of the battlefield. It's how quickly we have forgotten the religious dynamics of this war. There might be more that I don't know about, but this is the only book that I know about that actually goes into the religious element of the First World War. And it's quite phenomenal, the stories that come out of it, and the valence that the different countries have in terms of Protestant, Catholic, and again, it wasn't sort of just a line down the middle, because Germany, of course, has Lutherans and Catholics, and the French, well, mostly Catholic, and the English, well, Anglican, mostly Protestant. But how those dynamics then get fleshed out, and then all of the stories that come out of the battlefield, again, that are, in keeping with this kind of thing. And so again, illusion is not a great word. And what's happening now, and I don't know, again, if we will continue to use the word metamodernity, because I agree with Nate Heil and a bunch of the other people in this corner talking to Brendan Dempsey that I don't think his use of the word, and in fact, if that continues to be the use of the word, it's something that I won't use at all, because what we want is a language and vocabulary and worldview and system that can actually adequately handle the phenomenology of the Romans and the phenomenology of the Christians and the phenomenology that is afforded by what we learn in the world today through scientific realms. We are, in fact, looking to have a worldview that can talk about all of this. Now, you might look back at the Romans and say, well, that was, that was group psychology. Or that was, well, but the truth is, you needed something like Jupiter to sort of give the Roman spine to prevail upon the Sabines and then eventually to conquer the world. And if you get further into this, the Romans, if you asked a Roman, well, why are the Romans so successful in the world? It's because we have the best gods and or we know how to recruit the gods better than anyone else. Until, of course, this Jesus comes along, strange God that he is, having been crucified by Roman soldiers who goes on to conquer Rome. And you would think that is the strangest way to conquer an empire, to have your God crucified on a cross. And if you watch, I don't know how many Viking movies, they make that point again and again, because the Vikings come in and they're like, we have Thor, we have Odin. Your God seems like the loser there. And then he conquers all of the Scandinavians. He's a strange God who conquers by being crucified. It's a very strange thing indeed. Anyway.
That is a very powerful force in the universe. It's just not exactly as we see it. And as we've talked about here and elsewhere, many things that we believe in science aren't exactly literal either. So the idea that it's metaphorical is not pejorative. Did you have something you wanted to say?
Yeah, it may be an unuseful.
I don't watch them a lot. I met them when I was at the ARC conference, and but for both Bret and Eric, they looked at me like, do I know you? And then there's this look over their face like, oh, you're that guy that makes those annoying videos. But what I already talked about my interaction with Eric, but my interaction with Bret and Heather was, and so basically I think to myself, okay, I'm only probably going to have time for one interaction with these people my whole life, so I want to make it a positive one, and I want to make it an encouraging one, and actually, again, I don't necessarily watch a lot of their videos, and a bunch of you watch videos and always send me stuff when something would interest me, which I really appreciate. But one of the most delightful thing about these two is their relationship. It is just they're sensitive to each other. They love each other. And I just watch them and I just think God bless them. Maybe it's a function of being a pastor, and when you're a pastor, everybody else looks at this couple and says they're a great couple, and as a pastor you think, if you only knew how much work those two are doing to try, and I don't mean these two, how much work that couple is trying to do just to keep the whole thing together. But these two are just I love the way they relate to each other.
It's full rabbit warren to go down into. But I guess the phrase that we have used in the book and that you have invoked here and that you were using as a professor for many years, literally false, metaphorically true, is exactly this. It's a third way, and of course there are many ways, but people who hear the new atheists say religion's a mind virus may imagine that the only alternative is over here in religion, panpsychism, dualism, idealism land, right? Where there
You're really going to put all those together?
is a greater consciousness that explains things, or even a third type of thing that explains both matter and mind, if you will. And part of what you're saying and what we have said before is that no, there's actually, and it's not a middle ground, this is not a compromise, there is actually a way that natural selection can explain this that is yet materialist without being dismissive of all of the things over in this space around a preeminence of consciousness. However, the rabbit warren that may not be worth going into is, and I think this is an objection that we've heard come back at us, is the use of the word true, right? Extraordinarily valuable, thus making, and more valuable if you believe it to be true, is maybe a longer-winded way of saying what that two word ending to the phrase is, right? Literally false, extraordinarily valuable if you believe it to be true, so you're better off if you believe it to be true. Let's call that metaphorically true. But that's too many words.
Well, no, I like where you've taken us, because this is almost exactly the point I'm trying to flesh out, which is I don't believe that it's true with a wink. And I want to point out that what we have here is a relationship not unlike what you and I describe as the Omega Principle in the book. The Omega Principle, which is, we're not going to go deeply there at the moment, but the Omega Principle is the idea that cultural evolution is more powerful than genetic evolution because it is capable of producing much more rapid adaptation, which is why the genes have given us the ability to evolve at a cultural level. But it is inferior, so it is superior in the sense that it is faster evolving. It is inferior in the sense that the genes are upstream and therefore in a position to control whether or not you are a cultural creature or not. And so it is that relationship where that you've got two different kinds of superiority and they go in opposite directions, right? In this case, what we have is the superiority of the belief. If I find myself like Shackleton did, needing to survive in circumstances where giving up all hope would be the logical thing to do, I sure would prefer to believe that the companion that walks with me is a real creature who cares and is intervening on my behalf, right?
And is going to improve my chances of surviving this ordeal.
In fact, if I fail to believe that, it is likely to cause my death, right? So there's no comparison here about the superiority of the belief in the metaphorical truth here. However,
now, before he goes to his however, it's very interesting because, again, this 6 years of these conversations, 6 years of being on YouTube, all of the different conversations I've had outside of YouTube, all of the different letters and emails that I've gotten from people, and how many people saying to me, I've seen, I will rephrase them, I've seen the emotional and potential adaptive advantage to religion, but I just can't believe it's true. And I mean, he just kind of said it. It's like, well, yeah, if I'm out there in the car accident, but this is where it's really funny, because in my experience, when these extreme situations happen, it often doesn't matter so much what worldview you think you're carrying around with you. Because you probably don't even know the worldview that is really functioning under that system. Back to Peterson's Lafayette video.
Okay, so we're going to go to Alex, and then Saeed is going to distribute the mic.
Thank you for being here. I really appreciate it. So I was watching a few of your interviews in preparation for this, and I heard you speak about religion quite a bit. And if you look up what religion means in the Webster Dictionary, you get something like...
Michael, be very careful with dictionaries. They're usually worthless.
A system of faith centered on a supernatural being or beings or something like that. But I've heard you use religion to describe things like punk rockers, for example, that's a religious experience. So my first question would be, how do you define what is considered religious? And then sort of as a follow-up to that, if, say, Sam Harris...
Religious is what you act out.
What's that?
Religious is what you act out.
Anything you act out.
Everything you act out is predicated on your implicit axioms. And the system of implicit axioms that you hold as primary is your religious belief system. It doesn't matter whether you're an atheist or not. That's just surface noise.
So it has nothing to do with divinity or
No, I didn't say
supernatural
that.
beings?
No.
Or it doesn't necessarily have to do with those?
No, it probably necessarily has to do with it too, but it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with your voluntarily articulated statements about whether or not you believe in something like a transcendent deity. So, I mean, what you act out is much more what you are than what you say about yourself. And what the hell do you know about what you believe anyways? You're complicated, man.
It's a fair question.
Well, seriously, people are complicated. You know, like we're not transparent to ourselves at all. That's why we have to go to university and study psychology. It's like, you know, we're not exactly black boxes, but we are the most complicated things there are, right? And we can't even program our VCR clocks. So it's like, how the hell can we propose to understand ourselves? And, you know, I'm existentially oriented, which is to say that I think that what you hold to be true is best determined as a consequence of an analysis of your actions rather than as a consequence of an analysis of what you purport to believe. Now, in order to act, you can't act without a hierarchy of value, which I tortured the other poor questioner about. You can't act without a hierarchy of values because you can't act unless you think one thing is better than another. Because why would you act otherwise? So that means that you're embedded within a hierarchy of values, whether you know it or not, or maybe multiple fragmentary and competing hierarchies of value, which is all the worse for you, by the way, because it just makes you very confused. That hierarchy of values has an axiomatic, it's based on axioms. And the probability that you understand them is very low, because generally people don't understand their axioms. But that axiomatic system is essentially your religious system. And there's no way out of that as far as I can tell. And you can say, well, it isn't predicated on conscious belief in a transcendent deity. It's like, okay, have it your way. But, you know, most people in this room act out a Judeo-Christian ethic. And not only do they act it out, if they're treated in a manner that's not commensurate with that ethic, they get very, very, very annoyed. So, for example, if I fail to treat you as if you're an embodiment of a divine fragment, let's say, that's characterized by the ability to make free choice and to determine your own destiny in some sense, or if I fail to treat you as if you're a valued contributing member of the polity as a sovereign individual, then you'll find that very offensive and become angry. It's like, okay, then that's what you believe. Well, if I ask you if you believe any of that, well, that's a whole different story. You might give me some radical leftist nonsense. But that doesn't take away from what you've... that doesn't take away from the fundamentals of your action.
As one final thing. So when you and, say, Sam Harris argue about religion, you're arguing about fundamentally different things, it sounds like. His conception of what is religious is very different from yours.
Yeah, well, he tends to think of...
Yeah, because Sam is sort of fixated on God number 2. Is there a super thing up in the sky that I can call upon? And Jordan is fixated on what is the landscape that we have inherited that we actually act out of. And so then when you get over to Bret here, Bret thinks, I mean, I could pull up that little piece from Rebel Wisdom with Jamie Wheel, where Bret says, well, you could just override your evolutionary coding. And it's like, no, you won't. In fact, most of us are likely quite unaware of what we would do in an extreme situation. And that is a pretty common thing to notice from people. You get people in an extreme situation and they will act in different ways, often completely contrary to the codes that they ostensibly imagined they were going to inhabit. Here's another book that has showed up in various sermons and videos. Langdon Gilkey's Shantung Compound, the story of men and women under pressure. And he noted that, usually what happened to people was they acted out of what they were formed in. And their formation goes beyond just their own life since birth, and especially just since awareness. Their formation can go back generations. That's true biologically. It's true psychologically. It's true in terms of their worldview. And so people who complain that they see the benefit of, let's say, having a worldview in which an agent, a higher power, a God of their own understanding, could reach down and deliver them from the miry pit, as in a biblical psalm, that they would like to have such a thing. The answer to that is not volition. Well, simply close your eyes and try to believe it harder. No, the answer to that is, as it has always been, formation. That, in fact, if you want to live in that world, you are going to have to find a community of people who live in that world, and you are going to have to, in many ways, submit to their practices, to their rituals, to their customs, to their worship, and then be formed by it, and bit by bit, it will form you. Now, if in fact you can possibly succeed in having your children formed by that same thing, they might have a chance too, and your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren, because these things actually go intergenerationally. And if there's anyone that should understand that, it should be Bret. Because it was Bret, and this is part of the reason I appreciate him. He's sort of much more fully fleshed out than most, both the, let's say, the genetic complexity of this, but also the mimetic complexity of this, which again makes Richard Dawkins just a very interesting and strange example of, here I've got all of these theories. That's the chattering rider on the elephant, and the elephant says, but as for me and my rider, we're cultural Christians, thank you very much. We like Easter and Christmas, and Ramadan, no thank you.
However, there is also the flip side of this, and this is what I want to wrestle forth. In the responses to this tweet were many people saying that those who walk beside you in these times of emergency, those are your dead relatives, or those are angels, right? All of these beliefs. And
they're ghosts, they're angels.
Right.
Yeah.
They are part of a supernatural realm rather than part of a neurological realm. And here's my point. I am not trying to convince you to abandon that view. Again, I've just said it's almost certainly a superior view if you are in a dire enough position that you're going to experience this phenomenon. So I would be a real jerk to try to convince you not to accept these things.
And you would likely be unsuccessful.
What you mustn't do is take the significance of this phenomenon, which is profoundly important, and use it to constrain the materialist understanding of the world. Now, the materialist understanding of the world is definitely incomplete, right?
It's gappy.
It's so many gaps. Mm-hmm. So I'm not arguing we've got some beautiful picture that is complete and you must keep your religious stuff away from it. That's not what I'm saying. Mm-hmm. What I'm getting at is that, look, you're surviving based on the fact that the food shows up in the supermarket, transported by mechanisms that are downstream of a materialist worldview. In other words, nobody is in a position to discount that there is a material world and that it functions in a predictable way, which we can study scientifically. Yes, it's gappy. It gets less gappy over time when we do the job right. We may at the moment be in a mode where it's getting more gappy because we're doing the job wrong. But nonetheless, over long enough periods of time, we get better at understanding the material explanation for things that initially don't have a material explanation as far as we know. And somehow we together have to figure out how to deal with the fact that there is a real truth over in third man phenomenon, and there might also be a real truth over with my hypothesis about what these hallucinations of the afterlife are about. We do not have to, constantly be waving materialism at people who speak about these things.
So he's basically preaching to the materialists and trying to say, okay, creep away from that loaded gun that is new atheism. What kind of loaded gun is that? That is a literal gun. It is not a physical gun. Now, Michael wants to say it's a literary gun. Yeah, that too. And the words are very close. So it's a literal gun, but it's not a physical gun. And that's fine. What we're really trying to get at, and you can see even in a video like this, that the page is turning. Naturalism, the edges of naturalism are fraying. And what we're actually working on is trying to have a public communal system that can basically include people like this and try and have a sense for, well, how these different pieces of their lives fit together. Because these are important stories for these people. And again, as a pastor, well, who wanders into church? And what kind of things do people say? And, well, somebody wanders into church and, okay, well, why are you here? Well, I just thought I'd go to church. Oh, okay. And after a little while, it's not unusual you'll hear a story like this. And what did this story provoke for them? Now, of course, they weren't deep into Darwinism, as that's sort of the next section of Bret and Heather's video, where they both are declaring their anxiety over the future of the Church of Darwinism because many people are defecting, and maybe we can continue to adjust Darwinism so that it survives, because gosh, we love Darwinism, and gosh, we love the Christian Reformed Church, and gosh, we love the Episcopalian Church that the last Episcopalian has already been born, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, okay, fair enough. But we're trying to find a language, trying to have a system of understanding that works, but also doesn't just work individually, but works collectively and communally and even civilizationally. I haven't made the video yet where we start, because whenever the last couple of videos I made the point that the United States and Western culture, to a degree, founded a civilization, was working from a civilizational religion that wasn't necessarily propped up by a specific institutional church like the Roman Catholic Church, or like the Church of France or Spain, or the Patriarch of Moscow or Constantinople. In the United States, there was never the Patriarch of New York. Now, there might have been a patriarch in New York or an archbishop in New York, but New York was always something that was far beyond just the parish of the archbishop, or the diocese of Manhattan or something like this. So what happened was we had sort of an implicit agreements with respect to a civilizational religion that now, as we're getting to the edges of that, people are anxious and concerned about it because they're bumping into questions of pluralism, the likes of which we've never really had to deal with, and now we are having to deal with them. So that was the past prior couple of videos where I talked about that. Anyway, there's more in this video that is worth looking at: rejection of Darwinism, complexity in science, models and replication, all sorts of very all sorts of very interesting stuff in the video. So I really appreciate you. I won't name you here, but you who sent it to me. And yeah, so I haven't done much with Bret for a while, but in terms of his videos, but yeah, you can see, you look at Ayan Hirsi Ali. Now this dissenting dialogues video is just sort of a bootleg video. Hannah Long has sort of put it out on Twitter. So I assume that there will be more video coverage of that conference, which is very much this little corner adjacent. John Vervaeke participated, and it'll be very interesting to see. I forget who they paired him with, but I thought it was sort of an interesting pairing. I don't know if they paired him with that. And so anyway, it's going to be interesting. The page is turning. Justin Brierley's thesis, his book, his podcast I think that gets at to say the surprising rebirth of belief in God, yeah. But who God is, how God functions at the civilizational level, that's going to continue to be interesting to follow, because again, we're in this space of pretty pervasive pluralism forcing these kinds of conversations. So anyway, leave a message. Let me know what you think.